Hey folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we're looking at the brand new Arrow Yakuza double feature, Graveyards of Honor. Both films in the box set draw their inspiration from the novel Graveyard of Honor by Goro Fujita, an ex-Yakuza himself. The original film from 1975 was directed by Kinji Fukasaku, probably best known in the West for Battle Royale, one of his last films. Its modern 2002 counterpart was directed by Takashi Miike, the prolific director behind such cult classics as Audition and Ichi the Killer. Fukasaku's film follows the story of real-life Yakuza Rikyo Ishikawa, played here by Tetsuya Watari, probably best known for being the lead role in the effortlessly cool Tokyo Drifter. But this isn't that role. Ishikawa is, as I wrote in my notes, an absolute turd. He's vile to everyone around him, he attacks people without warning, and he causes his Yakuza family endless amounts of strife throughout the film. I mean, not long after we're introduced to him, he's seen weeing on people, and if that's not a sign that he's a bit of a wrong-un, I don't know what is. The film charts his attempt to rise up through the family during the 1940s. But he's an absolute loose cannon, can't be trusted, and he spends most of the film either being kicked out of the family, going back, being punished, people telling him to get lost again. I did spend most of the film just wondering why anyone was putting up with him and not just executing him there and then. I mean, he is such a pain in the arse, and I just kept wondering, I just didn't understand why anyone wanted him around. It's not like he's particularly useful. Perhaps that was just me not wanting to spend time with him and just hoping that someone would just cap him one. The film is incredibly bleak, I mean, understandably so. This is the real life story of someone who was clearly very unstable and a pretty nasty person. I think it's clear that Fukasaku was attempting to remove any sort of honour or glamour from the film that perhaps some of his earlier films in the Yakuza genre had put in there. I mean, I don't know how true to the real life story it is. I mean, it's not even particularly clear whether Fujita that wrote the book ever met the real Ishikawa, but even without that, you get the sense that no one particularly admires this guy. It's almost a way of putting a film out that says this life is horrible and it is filled with horrible people. It's almost got like a slight PSA quality to it. Much of this is helped by Fukasaku's usual filming style. He shoots things in a very sort of documentary style. A lot of his films have this. I mean, this film opens with black and white photos of Ishikawa as a child with people narrating it who supposedly knew him. Again, I don't know whether these people are actually real people that knew him or whether they're just actors saying whatever they want, really. Then we cut to sepia and Ishikawa attacks another gang's member just out of nowhere. He gets told off for this. Then we sort of cut back to colour, which is how most of the film plays out. It's very sort of bleak, washed out colour, but it is colour. We do occasionally switch back into sepia every now and again, and I think this sort of constant changing of film stock gives it that documentary edge of like, oh no, we've run out of film, we need to just use whatever's lying around. And it does help to sort of alleviate this sort of quite bleak, not particularly sort of thrilling colour palette. So much of the film is shot handheld, you feel like you are in the moment, you're being jostled about by the crowd, and you will spend a lot of the film looking at it like you've got a crick in your neck. The film also continues the narration from earlier on, although it is just one narrator, and I did find this quite handy because there were a few points, to be honest, where I got a bit confused by different people's names. You get different families turning up, you've got Chinese names and Japanese names, and I know it's my own sort of cultural bias that I'm not as good at picking up on different names, but it does get confusing a couple of times, so I was quite glad to have the narration sort of stop and go, and then this happened. This chaotic nature though is helpful. A lot of the film's sort of action sequences rely on feeling chaotic. I mean, there's a sort of ram raid on a gambling den quite early in the film, and this is just a sea of bodies, swirling camera and muzzle flashes going off. You really don't have a full sense of what's going on. It is just a lot of people, and you get the sense that this is what it would look like if 15 Yakuza just decided to run into one building. I do think there are, well, what I presume stylised moments. I mean, you see in a lot of Yakuza films, you get bits where there's like a truck and just like 30 Yakuza stood on the back of it. I've noticed that in a lot of things. I mean, Go to Hell Bastards has that in it. I mean, I presume it's stylised. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps if you were in 1940s to 60s Japan, there were just trucks full of Yakuza driving around. It's a bit strange, but I mean, it looks awesome. Overall, I do think the film's interesting, and I think if you're a fan of Fukasaku's other films, there's a lot to like here. I do think the sort of bleakness of the film can be a little bit oppressive. I mean, Ishikawa is so horrible that I didn't really want to spend the entire sort of 95 minutes with him, and there aren't many other characters that are even particularly fleshed out. You sort of remember people because they wear one outfit, and I do think that hurts the film. This also causes immense problems when Ishikawa discovers heroin, because he sort of mellows out, which is the opposite of what you expect when a character starts taking drugs, but he's not quite as violent, or at least I remember writing down like, ooh, nothing feels like it's happened for a while. And I think once you are just spending time with someone who's doped out of their head, who isn't very nice, you sort of lose a reason to watch the film, at least early on when he's unpredictable. It means that you've got something to keep your attention going. You sort of go, oh, I wonder what he'll do next, whereas then he's just sort of lay around doing sort of stoned out face, and it's not as interesting. And it does mean that the sort of second half is nowhere near as good as the first half, though it does pick up at the end, and you do get a couple of really bloody sequences, and I think they're some of the most exciting parts of the film. Miike's film updates the story to, well, what was then modern day. I mean, it's 2002. Oh God, that feels like so long ago. This time, our protagonist is Rikuo Ishimatsu, which I feel like he changed the name just to make it really difficult for me reviewing both films at the same time. I'm sure I'm going to slip up and say the wrong name at some point, so I apologise in advance. Ishimatsu here is played by Goro Kishitani, who I have to say gives a really solid performance. You do genuinely get the sense that he's a bit crazy and you don't really trust him to not shoot someone out of nowhere. The film kicks off with Ishimatsu saving a Yakuza boss from a would-be assassin, here played by Takashi Miike, having a bit of fun dual-wielding pistols, because why wouldn't you? And because he saved this Yakuza boss, the boss is like, why don't you come and be a Yakuza for me? And then he sets off in a very similar way to sort of rise up through the ranks, but he's just being crazy and horrible and detestable as he was in the last film. Miike has described his version of the film as the good-for-nothing and dangerous younger brother of Fukasaku's film. But given this statement, I was actually quite surprised how closely a lot of the plot points tie up. They are, narratively, pretty similar films with just a few little minor changes that sort of help to, in my eyes, sort of smooth the plot slightly. I do think the main difference in the performance, at least, is that you do believe that Ishimatsu is absolutely crazy from the start. He has a look in his eye in so many scenes where you just know that he's looking for an excuse to go off on one, but that even if he doesn't find one, that he's probably going to go off on one. I think this is actually something that Miike is an absolute master of long scenes where you just know something's going to happen. The camera pulls back, it holds on the scene far too long, and you just know that at any moment someone's going to like kick the table across the room or punch someone or pull out a knife. It's just, you're just waiting for that little bit too long. Someone should have left the room already, but they haven't. Whilst the original could never be called blood-free, I mean, there is some decent bloodletting going on. Miike's film just goes above and beyond on that front. I mean, there are a lot of shootings, some beatings with a pipe, there's quite a lot of stabbing, more stabbing than I was expecting, and a lot of it has got, you know, lots of blood spraying and people absolutely sort of drenched head to toe, hands covered in blood. I mean, this shouldn't really come as a surprise. I mean, 2002 is right at the end of what I would class as Miike's like golden period, where he's making a lot of his sort of really bloody films that get him the attention worldwide. I mean, this is just a year after Itchy the Killer comes out, which, if anyone's seen, you know the sort of gore going on in that film. I think all of these sequences are handled really well. The gore is pretty good. I mean, the blood looks a little bit red, but you sort of forgive it because there's so much of it on screen that you sort of roll with it. And I think so much of it comes down to Kishitani's fantastic cold performance, that he can stab someone and then just stare at them, not necessarily like run away. It's just this sort of cold mask comes over him, and it's quite intimidating and quite threatening. I will say that if sexual violence or violence against women is something that pushes your buttons, these aren't going to be the films for you. I mean, the original one you might get away with, but I would steer clear of the Miike version. I mean, if you know anything about his work, you know that he's not shy about this sort of thing, and Graveyard of Honour is no different. Miike's other films from this sort of era, you'll know exactly what to expect from the cinematography. There's nothing particularly going to surprise you. You get a lot of sort of close-up, shaky cam footage, and then those long takes that are sort of shot in a wide angle. The colour palette is very sterile, there's a lot of cold blues. Again, it's sort of the sort of stuff that he's been doing a lot around this era. I presume a lot of them are shot by the same people, they're all shot on the same cameras. Unfortunately, I do think a lot of the problems that I had with the original film aren't particularly fixed in this remake. Again, you are spending so much of your time with a character who is just detestable and doesn't have any redeeming features. I mean, there are a few more sort of characters that you get to know in this, but again, they're not particularly pleasant people. You're not rooting for anyone. It's, I guess perhaps the idea was to go for a sort of lesser of two evils aspect, but I don't think it really comes off. You don't really like anyone in either version. This also does mean that we have the same problem when we get to the heroine stuff of the plot screeching to a halt. I mean, Miike has a little bit more fun with this, as you would expect from someone who, in Dead or Alive, had a man take like a 100-metre long line of coke. You do get a couple of sort of tripped out scenes, a scene of Ishimatsu crawling around on the floor, sort of shot in a wide angle while he's shooting at the ceiling. Is pretty good. It never quite tips over into the sort of chaos that you expect from a Miike film. Also, Miike's film is more than half an hour longer than the original, and it does not need to be. I think someone really needed to go at this film with a pair of scissors. It's far too long, and if that had been done and they'd cut out a lot of the bits of him lying on the floor in a drugged up stupor, I think you would have a much, much better film, because you'd have a much tighter, more chaotic film. All this being said, Neither film is a bad film. I mean, they're incredibly well made films, and the performances are very, very good. I mean, for me to hate these characters as much and to not want to be around them this much, they have to be good performances, because otherwise they could come across as being really cartoony, or they could slip into being a bit funny, or just overtly evil in a way that would make you laugh, even if unintentionally. For me, so much of it is just that when you compare them to the works these directors have done, especially around these times in their career, they're just not quite up to those standards. I mean, Fukasaku had already done the first 5 Battles Without Honour or Humanity, and those are far more interesting films than this. And again, with Miike, he's already made Dead or Alive, which is so much more exciting, and you've already had Ichi the Killer as the sort of coked up, gory version of a Yakuza film. I think even his first film, Shinjuku Triad Society, has an edge over this because it's just got little weirder moments. I mean, if you are a fan of these directors, I would definitely say watch these films. They are great films if you know what you're going into. I wouldn't start with them. They're sort of perhaps in the B tier of these. I mean, Miike's made far worse films, but he's also made far better. So I'd say if you're a fan of either of them, this box set's great. Both films have been really nicely restored. You don't have the issue with Miike's version where it's not been shot on like standard definition, like something like Dead or Alive 3. So it still looks really nice. And I think, again, Fukasaku's version, the style that he has is very interesting. Perhaps if you've never watched anything they've done, I don't think these are going to be your best introductions to them. If I had to pick one of these films as a favourite, I think I'd go for the Miike one, just for I found its plot a little bit easier to follow, and the violent set pieces are just that little bit better. I think that's the only reason that I'm sort of leaning towards that. But that's just my opinion. Have you seen either of these films? Are you going to watch them now? Are you a Miike fan or a Fukasaku fan? Let me know down in the comments. Like and subscribe so that you don't miss any more videos, and I'll see you next time.